Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'll be discussing the parrotfish, as well as why we should be culturing it, benefits we can gain, they can gain, as well as the potential impacts it can have on the ecosystems that we both share. First, let's understand a little bit about the parrotfish, as well as where they come from. Parrotfish are native to all coral reefs, the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean reefs. They're most abundant in variety and volume in the Indian Oceans, and they live in subtropical and tropical ranges. There's over 90 species, and they're very diverse. They're primarily herbivores, but as you can see from the GIF, some of them are omnivorous, and they like to eat meat as well. So out of the 90 species available of parrotfish, I selected the green humphead parrotfish. Now, these beasts are huge. They can grow up to 4.2 feet and get up to 100 pounds over the course of their 40-year lifespan. So these are big, they're old, and they're ugly. Now, the front beak is actually all their teeth fused together to graze. They'll munch down on hard, stony corals and bite pieces off that they can actually chew down and digest, pass through at that point. They have lived on a diet of benthic algae when they're younger, and as they're older, they live on a diet of benthic algae as well as live corals. Their hump is used for breaking down some of those larger corals to eat, pissing up a little bit before they get the teeth in there, as well as in fights for mates and leadership of the school. There can only be one male per school, no matter how big it gets. Up to 150 fish is the average size. And there's only one male, so what they'll do is similar to bighorn sheep, they'll bump and fight it out with their humps actually until there's one male left leading the school as well as for mating. Now, unlike other parrotfish, they're not as territorial and docile in nature. So, compared to the lone aggressor, this is kind of more of a cattle species, and they'll graze in groups with only one male, like a bull, leading it. They inhabit a lot of reefs in the Indo-Pacific region and the Red Sea. And now a little bit more on that hump. The harder the hump is, the more algae and the more corals they can break off. So a little bit of natural selection there. The harder the hump, the more food that species or specific school can access. So rearing out and growing methods. These fish are broadcast spawners, so they're going to release a lot of the sperm and egg into the water column naturally, let that fertilize and then fall to the bottom. But for our purposes, an initial broodstock of sexually mature adults should be harvested before the breeding season, which is yearly, typically in the spring, and they reproduce every year. So the initial propagation should be done with a harvested egg sac and sperm from the broodstock. Unfortunately, there's going to be a loss of life for the broodstock, which you're taking it out of. And then they should be mixed together in a 150-gallon larval tank. Pelagic juveniles are going to need some grassy structure to settle on in that tank, as well as maybe some stones. As typically once they fertilize, they're going to settle down onto these grassy beds as they do in the wild. The juveniles should be fed algae and then algae feed with jointed calcareous algae as once they mature. So a little bit of that coral feel, as this is typically something that they eat in their juvenile stage in the wild as well. Once they're sexually mature, which is at 5 to 7 years old for the male, and then 6 to 8 years old for the females, the juveniles should be released for repopulation or harvested for food, research, or many other purposes. So they have that kind of weird slime on them that we haven't really figured out yet. But at that age, that 5 to 8 year old range, they grow up to 40 centimeters maximum at sexual maturity. So you're dealing with about a foot of fish here. But depending on how large you want the schools to be, that's how big you're going to have to size your tank for it. So while that sounds easy enough, there are a couple of potential farming issues. So parrotfish are protogynous hermaphrodites, so this means that they're all born female. Now, one male per school is the rule. That's set in stone or set in creatures that eat stone. And in the event of a female turning male, it can leave in the wild, but in captivity, they're going to be forced to fight it out for school leadership, which isn't something that you want to happen in your tanks. However, you can visually see this in the males. They change a little bit in the color, as well as being a little bigger. So you may be able to remove this if there's two fish that are fighting. Now, unfortunately, not too much is known about the wild juvenile populations due to their habitat, as they don't typically live in that grazing coral area. They'll live a little bit deeper in the ocean, actually. And it may incur unseen challenges, as we don't know too much about that lifespan. But the adults mostly feed on corals, so you may have to stimulate the habitat for the feeding to occur as they get a little older. So they might not really want to be too keen on the algae feed when they're developing these teeth to munch down on more of that jointed calcareous algae. So you may have to switch to 100% feed for that. And species graze in schools once they're much mature, as they're going to move around in droves in the wild. They typically don't stay to one area. They kind of act like wild cattle grazing around on a prairie, but You may have to have a really large pen in order to accommodate this roving school or move it into an ocean situation where you have them caged in. So why should we farm the bumphead parrot? So why should we farm the bumphead parrotfish? First of all, compared to other species of parrotfish, these are incredibly easy to farm. They have less aggression and they require less of a diverse diet. However, humphead parrotfish are currently in decline. They have a vulnerable status and they're incredibly sensitive to human activity, fishing, and habitat loss. A quick look at a NOAA fisheries report in areas like Guam, Fiji, and the North Solomon Islands, around 70% of the total reef catch is the bumphead parrotfish. But this is due to multiple factors. Now, the large adult size of bumphead parrotfish and their distinctive behavior make them especially vulnerable to these spear fishermen. Large schools foraging in shallow and mid-depth reefs by day aggregate in the same protected shallow habitats at night, making them easy targets to the modern spear fishermen. With new scuba tech gear like dive lights, freezers, and more sophisticated guns and spears and wetsuits, the ability to exploit bumphead parrotfish has increased dramatically over the last 7 decades, seeing record numbers of harvest. Taking 5 to 7 years for male sexual maturity puts the spawning late in the life cycle. And with only one male per school, the male numbers are not doing so hot. Regardless of how large the school is, there can only be one male. So if we farm them in smaller schools with multiple males per facility, we can see a dramatic increase in the male population. Population in isolated communities on the eastern and westerly outliers has also suffered due to the pelagic natures of the eggs getting swept up in currents and swept far away. Stocking these rapidly declining populations could see a population increase in these areas. Now, humpheads also fill the role as the largest bioeroder for these coral reefs. So, snacking and munching on all these corals, eventually what goes in must come out. So, these corals are digested, pass through these parrotfish, and excreted, as you can see in that top left corner, as sand. Now, this fresh sand is the next generation of reefs, as they're going to need this soft, new, fresh sand digested from all these previous corals in order to grow and further prosper. Now, one parrotfish can process up to 5 tons of reef carbonate each year, which is a lot. And compared to a more traditional view, these vegetarians are more sustainable than carnivorous fish farming as they don't require any fish meal or any other practices that a carnivorous fish would need. Thank you for watching my presentation. Thank you for watching my presentation. And I hope you can agree with me that we need a little bit more of these huge grazing water cows for our reefs as well as for our planet.